And if everybody can see it, are we good? Okay, fantastic. And can you hear me? Okay, outstanding. All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today for the dissertation defense. My name is Jonathan Borgwing. I'm a doctoral student at the Arizona State University, Mary Lou Fountains College. And today we're going to be talking about the research I've done surrounding Agile methodology integrating into the traditional ADDIE model. I would just like to thank my chair and my committee members, Dr. Aaron Rotherfuller, Dr. Stephen Crawford, and Dr. Otis Parsons. So the purpose behind the research as we started was to explore the Agile elements and how they could be applied to the ADDIE instructional design model to increase both effectiveness and efficiency. And through that, we also are looking to identify the impact of employing a modified ADDIE model that was influenced by Agile learning models. And not just the development phase, but also the outcome. And here we see the third purpose there is really identifying the impact on quality for that the model had on the produced instructional products. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to discuss the context, the problem of practice surrounding both at the national and the local level, a literature review, the theoretical framework, talk a little bit about the Agile methodology, and then the intervention, the Agile ADDIE framework, and reintroduce the concepts behind that intervention. Speak about the research questions, the methods, and then we talk about the exciting results and implications. Also discuss a little bit about the limitations, future research and implications, and then any questions that may be had. So when we look at the national context, instructional design is really built upon several models, but the ADDIE model is the standard in which many people believe sort of like the bedrock instructional design model. And specifically at the national context, when we look at government organizations, they traditionally use the ADDIE model. There's also the Navy who has done an iteration on that, which they put a planning phase before the ADDIE starts to task align resources there, but they also end up adding an additional step. And so what I've found is that it's really an issue of finding an effective model because ADDIE no longer works within our landscape of when we're developing courses. And that's seen through because it's a very linear model. And so we start with the analysis, then we move to development. And when we say linear, we're talking about completing one task completely before moving into the next. And so this linear model doesn't necessarily make itself available to the context that instructional designers find themselves in today. And so we really find ourselves dealing with an ineffective model that really doesn't work with the operating environment. And we find ourselves in a more rapidly developing situation. So anything from war, when we look at the Army, for example, when they went into Iraq, they started with a very traditional battlefield, and then it went to a more terrorist cell-centric environment, and the Army was unable to keep up with that demand because they were very focused on following the linear model, and it took too long for them to adapt into that situation. It took a long time, I should say. So when we look at the national context, now we can talk a little bit about where I work is the National Simulation Center. And at the National Simulation Center, we have 12 active course offerings. We use both the train the trainer and train the provider modality, which train the provider, excuse me, is the traditional environment where we have a learner come down to the National Simulation Center. We'll provide them instruction, and that's the end state there. They've acquired the knowledge. When we talk about the train the trainer, we're actually flying in trainers, and they're going to provide them the instruction, and then they'll go back to their facility and be more of a force multiplier on the objective there. Last year, we offered 16,000 CEUs, and some of the pieces that we have recently been part of was the rapid suicide prevention response during that crisis. And actually, we've led a lot of the educational efforts for the COVID-19 response here recently. In fact, using the Agile ADDIE framework as our model as we move forward in the National Simulation Center. So when we look at the literature, we see that ADDIE is increasingly difficult to implement for some instructional designers, specifically for their projects themselves. We find that they're getting caught up in non-essential tasks that really prevent them from making progress. And what's interesting is this specifically referenced in some of the literature about government itself. And we also see that ADDIE is very inflexible and inefficient. We see that with the linear waterfall model, and it makes it hard to react to the external environment and external threats to that project. But what we have seen is an infusion between the Agile concepts and instructional design models, and that has been successful in the past, to include merging rapid prototyping with Dick and Carey's model with some other models in the past. And then we've also seen that adaptability is key, being able to adjust in the process of your development. That's really important for instructional designers and the instructional design model itself. So then we start talking, so the theoretical framework we used, or that I used when sort of looking at the problem of practice is Agile. And Agile was started as a computer science concept where a bunch of software programmers got together and they tried to deal with some of their problems of practice, and they came up with this Agile manifesto, which really broke down some of the concepts to stay flexible and sort of make decisions at the last possible moment. And what we saw was that Agile theoretical framework moved from computer science into project management, and then it came into education in the form of two different models where we use that. That's the successive approximation model, as well as rapid prototyping. They both integrate a lot of those key fundamentals part of that theoretical framework. And so using that theoretical framework, I developed a model, an actual framework, I should say. It started as a model to integrate into and solve some of my local problems of practice. And initially, I called it the Agile ADDIE model. And it started with a very linear flow when moving from lots of feedback cycles. And as I iterated different processes with feedback, I realized that the model itself was getting more and more prescriptive. And I realized that it was getting more and more difficult and less agile itself, and started moving away from that theoretical framework. So I realized the model is not the right approach to that, but rather a framework in which you can adopt key attributes to any local context. And those key attributes presented themselves in a program assessment, an iterate, assess, align, assess and align cycle, and some Scrum methodology as well. And so when we talk about the iterate, assess, align cycle, we're talking about presenting a product or a solution that will go toward that training support package, and looking to see how we can not redevelop everything from scratch, but how we can use that and potentially iterate off of it, but also look to see how that piece of the puzzle, whether it's a PowerPoint, whether it's an evaluative piece, can inform your assessment, your analysis, and inform your development, or maybe even your design. And so we use that as a very free-flowing portion so that we can take advantage of opportunities as they arise within the development cycle. And we can also see in this chart that assessment is sort of broken off from the creation phase. The reason for that was before we can invest time and resources into a project, we want to ensure that the needs assessment is complete and that a solid gap actually exists. Once we have identified that gap has existed, or does exist, we can invest those resources. We also, when we talk about Scrum methodology, we're talking a lot about Kanban boards. Scrum is not actually an acronym. It's a rugby term that's been adopted throughout the Agile process. So But Scrum itself, they involve boards where you can identify different tasks. Sometimes we can hear them called stories, and we'll apply different points and values to those tasks and assign them accordingly. And then when we talk about sprints, we're usually talking about, especially in this situation, we're talking about a bi-weekly meeting that usually occurs. And that's the point of that, is to really make sure all communication for that project is occurring. So when we look at the totality of sort of what the Agile ADDIE framework is, it's really a program assessment with a kickoff meeting, an iterate, assess, align cycle that takes advantage of rapid prototyping and the ability to maintain flexibility within the creation phase, and implementing Scrum methodology as well within that development environment. We also typically consider the end of the creation phase a successful pilot. And that sort of moves you to the sustainment phase there. So when we approached this problem practice, I really came with two research questions in mind, and that's how did the Agile ADDIE framework and development working groups in non-traditional environments help overcome perceived issues of lengthy development time, inflexibility during the development, and resource constraints during the development. And during cycle 0 of the action research, and these three pieces became really evident as we did that. And then when we look at, we're looking at just the development cycle. As we move past that development cycle, we also wanted to see what was the impact on the products that were being produced. So not just the perceived outcome from the people in the development cycle, but what was that actual outcome? So our method, I used a concurrent mixed method action research design. We used a pre-post intervention interviews. That was qualitative in nature. We also used the ID management binder, which during my proposal, we spoke a little bit about how that was a notebook from OneNote. We actually iterated from that, and the VA offered a planner board across the enterprise, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment, but it provided actually additional functionality. So that is one delineation from the proposal itself. We also integrated focus groups. So after every sprint, the hope was to do it bi-weekly, but the focus group itself was occurred at the end of every single sprint. And then we also did weekly structured reflections. And at the conclusion of the development or the creation process, there was also a output of that training support package. And what we did there was we evaluated the quality of that product using the Merlot peer review form. As far as the participants that were involved, the ADDIE working group, we did a non-probability convenience sampling, and that was the individuals who were participating within that project. The client, the PM, the ISD, course directors, SMEs, EdTech, and SimTech consisted of that ADDIE working group. Now, we did not have the client participate in the research, and we had 6 members participate in the actual research itself. Of those 6 members, we did have representation from project managers, curriculum developers, subject matter experts, EdTechs, and simulation technicians. So we did have a well-rounded group. After the participants that actually participated in the creation phase, then we moved to the output, which was the training support package. We had 4 reviewers contribute to that. Each of the, yes, yep.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Just to be clear, in terms of the members of the group here, what was your role in it?
Okay, so that's a great question. So I was the instructional designer during that process. Yep, that's a great question. And participated in the development. I also identified during our kickoff meeting that I did have a personal and a professional stake within the development and the success of the project. And so that bias was something that we definitely paid attention to throughout and made known to all the participants. So there was also reviewers. that we had each of those reviewers. We had 4 reviewers. I initially was very, very hopeful, and I thought I had recruited 10 reviewers. But as far as getting the consent forms back from them, I ended up with only 4. So I was really hopeful. I was a little disappointed with 4. But once those 4 people that we did get, they all had 3 years of experience creating products using formal instructional design processes and at least a master's degree in instructional design from a regional accredited institution. And we did have 1 individual that had a more generalized educational degree, but had 5 years of instructional design experience or more, which was part of the criteria.
Were these IDs inside or outside of the organization?
They were outside of the organization. They had, every single one of them had done work for the government, because instructional design for the government is sort of a unique piece in and of itself. So they all had experience there, but none of them were part of the VA.
Okay, all right.
So some of the tools we used was the pre-post interview, semi-structured pre-post intervention, semi-structured interviews. The constructs there for the pre-intervention was time, flexibility, and resources. And that was just based on their perceptions of the ADDIE model, not based on the intervention. And then during the intervention, those same questions were asked. In addition, questions were asked about program assessment, kickoff meeting, the iterate, assess, align cycle, and the ID management binder, specifically the Scrum board and the sprints themselves. One of the other collection tools that were used was the ID management binder. And we can see actually a picture of one of the tasks. I blacked out the names there, but we can see this is actually a live board where you can see sort of the milestones, what was in progress, and as individuals move from one to the next, their cards would be shifted to where it was as far as in progress, and allowed us to track on a bi-weekly level, and even when I wasn't there, what needed to be done, so they could form their self-forming teams, if you will. The burn down, we track the information through a burn down rate tracker. And what that means is basically the amount of points that was expected to be completed, 1 point being 1 hour of productivity versus what was actually achieved. And then we also were able to keep track of progress to major milestones. And those major milestones were the instructional design deliverables, the needs assessment, front-end analysis, instructional design document, and the training support package. The focus group was another tool that was used. It occurred at the conclusion of every sprint, and the 3 constructs for that was time, flexibility, and resources. The focus group was supposed to happen bi-weekly. During the intervention, we had a hurricane, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's. So it was great to test the flexibility of the model and of the framework, and a few surprising things happened during that time, which was interesting. But needless to say, the bi-weekly meeting sometimes did not occur. And finally, there was weekly, not finally, but the last creation phase collection, weekly structured reflections. And the 3 major constructs there were time, flexibility, and resources, again, with a narrative block in order for general comments about how the development was occurring. And that was completed weekly regardless of any storm, regardless of any hurricane. And when we looked at the collection data for the evaluation of the training support package, which included the lesson plan, the scenario guides, and really the encapsulation of the end product, we used Merlot's peer review form. We did look at, I also looked at some of the other collection methods such as Quality Matters, but really Merlot was ideal for non-modality specific and non-domain specific evaluation. Really, Quality Matters has several great tools, but they focus on virtual and they focus on blended learning. So this was suited our learners best, and it really, if you look at the tool, it actually has one of the first section right there is quality, which is great, the quality of content and the potential effectiveness as a teaching tool. The constructs align directly with the research questions. So as far as the analysis that was conducted, under the process for research question 1, the pre and post interview questions, we did the pre and post interview questions, the focus groups, the weekly structure reflections, and the Scrum burn down rate. Grounded theory processing, or grounded theory analysis, was used through a open coding followed by Naxal coding, followed by category coding. And as far as that information was triangulated with the descriptive statistics from the burn rate. The output for research question 2, descriptive statistics were used as well, including a t-test. And we also did coding, open coding and theming on the input that we got from the narrative sections on the instrument. So research question 1, specifically time, what were the results? Well, the results initially was there's the Scrum burn down. We were actually able to look at and compare the actual performance of the Agile ADDIE framework in comparison to an average of what was done at the National Simulation Center. And we saw that there was 86 days faster within the overall training support package. We also noticed that the needs assessment took longer and the front-end analysis was substantially shorter, as well as the training support development. We also saw the theme emerge that the iterate, assess, align cycle allowed for, was attributed to that, the speed, based on the themes that emerged from the focus groups as well as the post-intervention interviews. So what was very interesting, and when looking at the data and doing the analysis, is that the Agile ADDIE framework actually created a product that was not just perceived to be quicker, but was actually quicker and was substantially quicker, 86%, or not, excuse me, 86 days quicker than the average. And what was also interesting was the IAA cycle was specifically attributed during the post-intervention as expediting that process. One of the other things that was attributed to that speed was a shift from process to making it SME-centric, maximizing their time on the ground. And that helped increase the time that it took, or decrease the time it took to create the courses themselves. So one of the other things when looking at research question 1 is we looked at what was the flexibility, what was the impact of flexibility. And we noticed that from the themes from the pre and post interviews, from the weekly structured reflections, as well as from the post-intervention interviews, that flexibility increased productivity. And that, again, was attributed to the being able to conduct quick fixes for anything from the IDD to the training support package, but it also allowed for quick fixes from a more general standpoint from the program development, which was identified by the post-intervention interviews. The Scrum methodology was also specifically identified by both the weekly structured reflections as well as the post-intervention interviews as something that increased the flexibility of the model, the framework, excuse me. And so when looking at the themes that really emerged, we look at resilience of the development cycle. Flexibility really helped with making it a resilient framework. During that development cycle, there was actually 2 personnel that actually dropped. We lost our project manager, and then there was an evaluative project manager as well, who also we lost fairly early in the process. Typically, losing a project manager has substantial impact, but as was identified in the post-intervention interviews, we were able to keep on moving and continue from losing that individual, overcoming the gap that occurred based on losing that individual. There was also the changes in requirements that occurred. being able to be resilient to those changes and react to them in accordance and not have to move back from, say, development or design into the analysis phase seemed to make it more resilient to, or the framework more resilient to those changes and challenges. And then the Scrum methodology, the self-defining teams, the communication and the ownership of the process really help with the flexibility as well. And while Scrum methodology is one of the components of the Agile ADDIE framework, it really contributed to the allowing for these subject matter experts to take control and have ownership within there, and that seemed to help with the flexibility as pieces came down, as things were changed. And the third part of research question 1 that we really looked at was the resources. Several times during the post-intervention interviews, individuals, and during focus groups specifically, because the focus groups were happening at the end of every 2-week cycle traditionally, individuals kept on identifying that there were no resource constraints that came up. There were no resource constraints. And when we did talk about resource constraints, when those really came up, I saw that come up in the kickoff meeting, where they were able to identify what those resource constraints potentially were, and the design and development process was adapted in order to potentially overcome them and find solutions. And having that leeway was apparent from the interpretation of both the post-intervention as well as the focus groups. And really, when we look at what resource constraints, what the impact that the Agile ADDIE framework had on those resource constraints, I think based on what the biggest one was subject matter expert availability on demand. During the pre-intervention interviews, it was identified that there's never enough subject matter experts available, and that's something that was constantly an issue. This was not the case during the actual Agile ADDIE framework. They were able to be implemented and integrated into the process in a just-in-time manner, and that was substantial and was a very large change from what had occurred in the past. In addition, the SME availability, being able to leverage SMEs in a just-in-time manner, as well as the material acquisition, there was never a need for that, and that was actually expressed during the post-intervention interviews. But it does seem that the Agile methodology, to include the rapid prototyping, allows individuals to foresee, or allows the groups to foresee, the potential resource constraints, specifically with the kickoff meeting. The kickoff meeting, when talking to the stakeholders, and during that whole brainstorming session that occurs during the kickoff meeting, when following the Savvy Start model as a successful approximation model uses, really expanded that ability to sort of foresee those challenges. So research question 2 looked at the outcome, and this was a little bit of a surprise, but we can see here the scores, the mean scores, which were given. The Agile ADDIE framework for both quality as well as effectiveness was increased, but it was a statistically significant difference. What should be said is the ease of use was not statistically significant. That adjustment was not there, but it was rated higher than the Agile, but the difference was not statistically significant. And we looked at both the qualitative as well, and while we did not get as much data as we would have liked, because several participants did not actually fill out the description portion of that, they did identify that both models were both the courses that were produced, because we used both one that was created by the Agile ADDIE framework and one that was created by ADDIE, the traditional model. They identified that both of the instructions were clear and concise, but they did say that the ADDIE model lacked the content that the Agile ADDIE framework did, and that was a large delineation between the two of them. And so really, when we look at the outcome to quality, we're seeing that there were more effective teaching tools. It produced a more effective teaching tool and a better quality based on what the data was telling us through that analysis. So what were some of the limitations that we said? Well, the number of courses was a limitation. And that was based on the research design. I didn't want to have the subject matter experts in one course and their perceptions of what was happening be convoluted or tainted from another course that they were doing as well. So we only used one course this time to identify what that adjustment was. In addition, we didn't go into the sustainment cycle during the Agile ADDIE framework. And we'll talk about this in just a moment, but I believe that there is a real opportunity for continued research in this area. The sustainment cycle itself imbues a lot of the positive attributes that came from the creation cycle, and pushing those into the sustainment cycle, I think, would be interesting to see what would happen. And then research access to other government entities. I wasn't able to sort of get in and present this model and have them take up this model as a potential action. It would be nice to see how other entities would be using this Agile framework. And so for future research and what those implications are, I think that the one that immediately jumped out at me was the sustainment cycle. I would really like to see the impact that the sustainment cycle has on the outcome of the product after 1 year of revisions. And I would also like to see based on the positive, not the positive, but based on the outcome of a more efficient, more effective, and a faster product, I'd like to see that same model applied to more courses and more sites to see what the outcomes are there. It would be interesting to see how it performs in those types of settings with more generalizability. And then when we look at what is next for the Agile ADDIE framework, I would really like to implement it at the Department of Defense. They have instructional designers at the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence that are looking forward to experimenting with it on their sites and in their courses, as well as several individuals within the Navy who are looking to potentially utilize it at their facilities. And as the National Simulation Center is actually moving away from EES, which is the Employee Education System, and we're moving into innovations, which is a different section within the VA. It'll be interesting to see potentially using this as a distribution of an innovation as we figure out how we're going to create courses in an expedited manner. And finally, the Agile ADDIE framework has been used for COVID-19, and it'll be interesting to see how the model reacts to these changing dynamic and domain. This is really stressing the flexibility and the ability to stay up to date. It requires flexibility, and with hourly changes to the domain, it needs to maintain that flexibility. So far it's been holding pretty well, but this is what it's currently in the process of going through, and it's very interesting to see. And so I would like to thank everybody, and any questions that you may have.
I've gotten asked a lot of questions, so I'm going to open it up to the two of you first.
Okay, I'll go first. So, trying to figure out which one I want to go with first. So early on, you used the average number of days to complete an ADDIE model simulation project. Where did that number come from?
That's a great question. So that number comes from using SMEs. The National Simulation Center has a complexity calculator that they use that was built from SMEs taking an average of what they felt certain sections of the course would occur. Those numbers were then conferred with the big dog, little dog juxtapose reference site, who actually uses the Air Force's doctrine on how many hours it takes to develop a course. And so that's how they came up with that, that model. But really it was the subject matter experts at the National Simulation Center, the three curriculum developers, myself included in those three curriculum developers, but coming up with how long does it take to do an analysis, how long does it take to do with a assessment and norming those numbers.
So do you have, given the number of courses that that you said that SimLearn produces, do you have data to indicate how many days it took to develop those courses from intake to, say, pilot?
Well, so that's, again, a great question. No, that data does not exist. In fact, moving forward, that data will exist because a system was just put in place to sort of calculate that data. But that data did not exist. And so that SimLearn complexity calculator was actually created in order to start norming that data and seeing where it occurred from there. But every course is also unique, and so it's sometimes difficult to create, especially with simulation, where you could have something that is a fully immersive nursing course that would require less time on task to potentially get task trainers, to maybe a hybrid course with physicians and anesthesiologists, where the level of complexity may change drastically.
So in your complexity model, where does this project fall within the complexity of, within your model, within the SimLearn's complexity model, where does this project that you did fall?
That's actually a great question as well. So within within that complexity model, there's actually 3 categories. There's simple, intermediate, and complex. And within that, within those, the average was taken. So the intermediate course was taken at 240 days, which was the average life cycle of a course for that. With and I have the numbers in the PowerPoint, but it's, I think 156 days is what it took for the development of the entire course. And so those are how those numbers were compared. But there are 3 different phases based on the level of complexity of the domain and how difficult it is, and based on the intake after the needs assessment. Because every needs assessment, the assumption is it takes 45 days to complete. And after that point, then the numbers for the front end, the instructional design document, or the design, and the training support package differ based on that level of complexity that's assigned.
Okay. All right. And by the way, well done on the presentation. Good job.
Thank you.
So I kind of want to, first off, yes, well done on the presentation. And one of the areas that as I was reading through the dissertation, and again, the presentation kind of struck me as kind of along the lines of what we're talking about now, and that is about that extended needs assessment phase. As someone who's led a number of projects, I've seen where inadequate needs assessment phases has led to more production time because of unnecessary complexity or confusion, and other problems down the road. Can you talk about why you think the needs assessment phase was longer using the Agile ADDIE, and any potential impact it's had on shortening the other phases?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Agile ADDIE framework, during the needs assessment, we didn't necessarily change any of the forms that were done, but the client involvement in that needs assessment was much greater, because that's one of the key attributes with Agile concepts, is that integration with the client, putting the client as close to the product, state products, as possible. And so I think the client had a much greater involvement, and therefore it took longer to figure out exactly what was going to identify as that gap. And then what we did one step further was we didn't say that the needs assessment was complete until the kickoff meeting had occurred. And during that kickoff meeting, the front end analysis was confirmed as well, or excuse me, the needs assessment was confirmed by the client during that time. And so there was a little bit of a challenge getting the client to meet, because they're a national program office, and they're very busy individuals, but demanding that, not demanding, that's the wrong word, but requesting that and soliciting that involvement in the needs assessment, I think, was critical to really shaping and understanding what the requirements were. And if we look at how those dots represent, I think, 5 days apiece. But if we look at the shortening of the time during the front end analysis, I believe that had a direct involvement, it can be directly attributed to the client's involvement and has set the pace moving forward, but also because we were able to gather ancillary data that also contributed to the front end analysis during that time. And I will also attribute, though, the shortening of the front end analysis to the kickoff meeting. The kickoff meeting where expectations were discussed was with the client involved was something that was in line with the Agile format, but not necessarily something that was demanded in the past as well.
Under the traditional ADDIE format, do you think having access to the client as much as you did at the beginning would have yielded a similar result, or what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that having access to the client would have reduced the same level of access would have reduced the overall timeline substantially. But I think that the continuous involvement of the client, and that's something that was stressed, helped shorten other phases as well. So if we look at how long it took to develop the training support package and that feedback loop, and when we look at sort of how it was put together with the Agile ADDIE format, that linear flow is kind of the needs assessment portion is accurate, but really everything was being built at the same time with feedback and being given and things being adjusted very quickly. And so the direct involvement in the client with that, I think as soon as you break that needs assessment portion down from the Agile, that's where you really get your money, if you will. And so I think you would see a reduction, to answer your question very concisely. I think you would see a reduction in the overall timeline for the needs assessment, but I think after that, you start to get back to the same issues.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our clients are kind of used to okay, I've given you my stuff, I go away and magic happens here, and they get a product on the back end. With that mindset, maybe still, I'm just going to assume, still prevalent in many clients. As you further implement Agile ADDIE, how do you see overcoming that client going, what do you mean you want me more involved?
Absolutely. So again, not demand, because the client here definitely outranks anybody involved, but I attribute it to the kickoff meeting where we set expectations. And we have, the expectation was that the client would attend the bi-weekly meetings, the sprint meetings that we had. And they were enthusiastic about it. And what we noticed was the more involved the client was, the more enthusiastic they got with the program, because they had buy-in in the process and they were approving things and seeing progress being made. And I really attribute it to the kickoff meeting. I think that was one of the essential bits of the Agile ADDIE framework. And I should say we use the, sorry, not the, but we use the Savvy Start sort of model. We took a lot of those pieces from the successive approximation model. And that Savvy Start model really I attribute a lot of that brainstorming session to getting the client excited about what was happening.
So I will ask, as you know, I think we've talked about what you've done a lot, and you've definitely shown the changes in the timeline in terms of the traditional versus the Agile model. Do you think it's fast enough at this point? Like, do you think that you've had a real life test over the last few weeks? I know, and you know, you're from 100 and whatever days down to 86 less days, but 86 less days is still a lot of days if you have to turn something around quickly. So how do you determine when your process is really both efficient and maintaining that quality well enough?
That's a great question. So I would say it's never fast enough. I'm never satisfied with it being what it reaches. But the other thing is the client sort of dictates the outcome. When the client, not the outcome, it dictates the end state. So at the National Simulation Center, when we typically build courses, one of our major issues is we don't have subject matter experts that we can add to courses. And so we are unable to progress very quickly. And so we do a lot of courses at the same time. What we found here is SMEs were directly integrated at the right time, at the right moment. Is it fast enough? I would argue that there's always ways to improve it. There's always opportunities to take advantage of. Excuse me. But if we look at how the Agile ADDIE framework has reacted to the COVID-19 response, I think that it gives the opportunity to the instructional designer to be as fast as they let it be, as well as the SMEs, because it provides the opportunity to be very quick. And you have to look at, I think you have to weigh the outcome. And so one of the questions I typically had for people running the successive approximation model, which goes through 3 pilot phases, and it's supposed to be iterative and go over and over again, is when do you stop? And their answer is typically when the client says it's approved and they like the product. But we are also the client. And so that's really where the sustainment part comes in too, where we have to make the determination of, is it good enough to go into production? And then we have a constant improvement portion during the sustainment cycle. That's why I'm actually really excited to see in future research that I can potentially do is that sustainment cycle. And in fact, we have implemented that a lot of that sustainment cycle already at the National Simulation Center, and they are constantly updating their programs. Which is also interesting is the course that the Agile ADDIE framework was compared to had gone through an entire year of iterative changes and improvements, and it was still of better quality.
At least your SMEs thought so when they were rating the 2 next to each other, right?
What's that?
I said the SMEs thought so when they were rating the 2 next to each other.
Yeah, roger that. Yep, absolutely.
Quality. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, are are most of the quality determined by the SME or the client? I'm just curious. It's not my area.
Yeah, no. I would. The client will accept the project, but I think really the quality is going to come from the learner. How are we able to close the gap during our level 2 evaluations? How does it transfer to during our level 3 90 days later? And then how are we hitting those larger professional goals, or not professional goals, business goals that they have? So are we able to close some of those gaps? And where is the ROI there as well? And that would be very interesting to see is how, I think that would be the next logical jump, is now that we have the course and we can see the sustainment cycle, what is the outcome to the level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of Kirkpatrick, 5 being return on investment.
The old IND in me is so happy to hear that. Closing the gaps, love it.
Yep, absolutely.
So Jonathan, I guess, lack of a better term, you chose the MOCA course as your control for the comparison.
Yep.
Talk about your thought processes in picking that course. And were there other courses that would have made a better comparison, such as other MSK courses?
Absolutely. So when I looked at what courses to do, I sort of figured I'm going to use the last course I know that went through the ADDIE model from start to finish, and that's traditional, because the problem was, as we were developing this Agile ADDIE framework, people were stealing those concepts and started integrating them into development courses. But I knew that MOCA had been done through the traditional ADDIE model. In addition to that, the courseware was being updated for the other MSK courses, because initially the idea was, this is great. Similar content, similar starting points. I can just grab this and present it. But the problem is, a lot of that courseware had already changed by the time I tried to get hold of it, and was being updated in a manner that would sort of remove the traditional ADDIE framework from that concept. If that makes sense. But my determination was the last course to be developed through the straight traditional ADDIE model.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like you've done some more of this, beyond, implementing Agile ADDIE beyond your study. It sounds like there's already been a couple of opportunities. How do you, I guess one of the questions I want to ask is, how do you see this being further used in your organization, and what role do you see in playing that? How do you, if this is efficient with one case, how do you expand that innovation beyond?
Absolutely. So that's a great question as well. I think the biggest thing is when I looked at creating this intervention, I didn't want to just say, let's use the successive approximation model, because it's unrealistic for some people in the government to be able to implement that at their site. So I think now the next phase is to start both mindshare educating individuals in some of these agile processes and how they can potentially implement it at their organizations. The other thing is getting instructional designers to start using these, and that starts at the National Simulation Center. It's also then looking to reach within my organization out to other instructional designers and show them these concepts and methodologies. A great example right now is actually this COVID-19. We have an instructional designer that's been brought into the National Simulation Center and is getting trained on how to actually use the Agile ADDIE framework. But it's not just within the National Simulation Center and EES, but sort of reaching outside of that as well. The goal is to really proliferate this concept. And after this discussion that we have, my hope is to further promote and educate through workshops as well as discussions with instructional designers and potentially talks as well to try to convince people who are stuck in ADDIE how they can bring some of these great things that other people are able to do with, say, rapid prototyping model, or that have that additional freedom, but are stuck in specific systems.
So it sounds like you're in a position that your sphere of influence can help push this forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So I know that you're constantly refining your process and the models and doing that. Do you think that you will continue to use the research processes you used throughout this dissertation in the future, or how do you see kind of incorporating that research process into what you're doing? I know your positions changed and roles have changed a bit, but how do you see that continuing?
Yeah, in fact, yes, I would like to continue to do research for a few reasons, but I would very much like to continue the scholarly work that has been done here and move it further along with and potentially convince and bribe other instructional designers to do their own action research and within my organization and elsewhere, so that they can sort of identify the impact on their organizations. Because when I initially got into this and they said I want to change this ADDIE model, it was because I was coming from the Army, which is a completely different organization within the government, and we were unable to react to the hybrid threat environment in Iraq. And we weren't there, we weren't training soldiers like they should be. And so, yeah, I would like to continue to do this research, not just at the National Simulation Center, but continue to do action research with partners at the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence, at the Navy. This is the jump off point, if you will, to that action research is my hope.
What kind of data do you need to help, since you're talking about continuing the scholarly side, what kind of data would you need to be able to help convince the powers that be to maybe change regulations to utilize Agile ADDIE as opposed to just ADDIE? So
I think it's not, I think some qualitative pre-post interview data would be persuasive and show sort of the major concepts, but a lot of it's going to be quantitative data, hard numbers to show both the efficiency and effectiveness. And I believe that if the scope is increased to additional sites, that you can do that. When I was doing my initial research design to figure out how I wanted to do this research, there was an individual who had set up some constructs of how you could prove different models and different ways in which to do that. And one of them was to build courses side by side, the exact same content with similar SME groups. And so that would be a great way to sort of show that exists. The problem comes, especially when we're talking about the medical side of things, that is an incredibly expensive thing to do because we have subject matter experts on both sides that cost a lot of money. So I think showing success of what happens to learner outcomes, the gap analysis as far as closing the gap with that ROI, showing Kirkpatrick data I think would be very interesting, and showing how transfer occurs between or maybe an increase, because we're looking at a potential increase in quality. Now, how that impacts transfer of knowledge and closing of skill gaps, that is a question that still has to be answered. It will be a great follow-up research as well.
Jonathan, you mentioned that you lost a program manager early on. And the project manager was, according to you, ultimately responsible for the project and the acquisition of products and contracts. Who filled the functional role of that program manager?
So the initial project manager, and this is the curriculum developer and the project manager worked in tangent during these steps, with the project manager dealing with the contracting issues. But we lost the project manager for contracting and that bit toward the end of the cycle. The evaluations project manager we actually lost very early on. I think it was in the first 2 months or a month. It was right after we had done the kickoff meeting, about 2 sprints after that we had actually lost the evaluations program manager. And the PM associated with the contracts and acquisition, we lost a week before the end of the project. But we were still able to overcome those barriers because we were able to have somebody else come in. So a lot of those issues had been resolved as far as contracting goes.
So does those losses and different people fulfilling those roles, does that affect the validity of your research or your ability to replicate this model in other scenarios? I mean, how hard was it to adjust to the losses?
Yeah, the adjust, I mean, specifically toward the very end, I think it had a very small impact because subject matter experts were finalizing the content and the acquisitions had been completed. But this is something, no 2 projects are almost ever going to be the same. There are so many external factors that are going to impact. You could have clients drop out, lose money, change their requirements on you completely. I believe that the program manager being removed was something that could happen on any other project as well. And in fact, very well may happen on almost all of our projects based on the length of time some of these projects occur. So I think hopefully it is not replicated on other projects, but I think it very well may be.
And what about your evaluations PM? Any adverse issues related to that so far?
So far, no. The evaluations project manager had actually created the evaluations plan, and the curriculum developer, myself, I was integrated into that process from the get-go. And when we developed the level 1 through 4 evaluations, we did that evaluation in mind with that PM there. So really it was, and I do want to the sprints really helped with that communication piece. And I think that was part of that flexibility and resiliency of the framework, because everyone was forced to discuss their deliverables every 2 weeks. And so there was constantly a handoff, and communication was normed after the kickoff meeting and after the sprint once that culture change had sort of occurred as well.
I don't have more questions for you, but I will leave it open for the others if you have some more.
I have one more. Jonathan, there was significant discussion about how the model offered flexibility. So this is 2 questions around flexibility. in many cases, when you are more flexible, that can lead to scope creep. So how did you control against scope creep given the model offered more flexibility?
Yeah, so that's okay. So this is a great question. So it actually did involve scope creep. They wanted to include an entire module on the back halfway through the development cycle. Because we were so flexible and agile, and we could show that their changes could be integrated very quickly, the client had confidence that after the initial rollout of the course, that we could integrate that back module, and that the gap was still solved by the current. I want to say, I'll mess up the content now, but we had 2 different modules, and that solved the initial gap that was discussed. But the scope creep did occur, and the question was how do we integrate the back? And the back being something that was also critical was decided halfway through, so we had to change the requirements. Because we were so agile and flexible with our iterative ability to integrate things, the client was very at ease to integrate it after the fact in a year or 6 months, because we didn't even have the content yet. But we were able to provide that material to solve that gap much sooner based on their confidence in the process. So,
and the second part is, did the flexibility that was created come from the model itself? And I'm not sure, or the communication technology of bringing everyone together virtually into a virtual environment?
Yep. So I would say the reason why I'd say it's the framework is because we initially had a lot of issues bringing everybody online with the planner, and the planner was functional, and people were using the planner to do their self-defining teams. But really, a lot of communication happened in email as well, as far as interchanging what needed to happen next. And so while the planner was utilized as a core concept, there was really no change to the method of daily communication between different participants. And so while the intervention introduced the Scrum board and people were using the Scrum board to follow on tasks and identify that, a lot of the communication remained the same. I think the difference is the way the communication was phrased and the scope and framework in which it was happening, where people were empowered rather than following the process and saying that, okay, this is the next deliverable. They had ownership in the process. So I think that helped with the flexibility a lot.
Well, unfortunately, that's my last question.
I kind of want to hit on that flexibility theme you were on a little bit. So let's imagine a world where most of the teams are using a Agile ADDIE model. What do you see that having the resource flexibility is great, but the problem is if you have multiple teams who, with the ADDIE model, you kind of look at it and go, okay, this is the window, this is the window. You can stage things across and go, okay, you can look out 6-9 months in advance and go, I have the right resources I need. But the problem with some of the flexibility here is that you may actually have every single team competing for the same resource the same week. How do you see that being mitigated, moderated, dealt with, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And it's interesting. So if with limited resources and people competing for those resources, let's say, so subject matter expert is a great example of that. One subject matter expert, everyone needs his time. How do we facilitate that? I think with the Agile framework, you are able to move into different sections. So for example, if my subject matter expert's available for team 1 in the very beginning of the day, I can immediately start working, have team 1 work with them. In the meantime, team 2 could be working on other different pieces of the puzzle. And I think if you have a limited resource where only one team can interact with that, then I think you need to collapse the teams into one team, because that's going to be your rate limiting step, regardless of how flexible you are there. And I would argue that maybe you also have to look at potentially acquiring more resources, and that would happen potentially during the kickoff meeting, where you start identifying some of these rate limiting steps, such as subject matter experts. What we did at the Agile ADDIE framework kickoff meeting is we identified with the client saying, hey, these are our resources that we need. typically subject matter expertise is something that we have an issue getting hold of, and the client, who was very enthusiastic and involved, was able to get additional subject matter experts. And I think that enthusiasm comes from their integration starting at the kickoff meeting, rather than just because of this framework is, or just because this client is enthusiastic in general.
Well, and I'm also thinking about non-SME resources. So for an example, you take kind of like my environment, you know, we have almost 22,000 courses that we teach here in the Maricopa Community Colleges, and all but 700 of them have suddenly gone online. And so they all want to use maybe multimedia production teams, studio resources, different physical resources where it's a zero-sum game. There's one camera, or there's an X number of cameras. And having all those resources during the production cycle, do you see that being a problem? I'm not sure how online your programs are or might become because of the current situation, but do you see that being a process that needs to be managed? And I guess maybe what I'm asking is, do you need to have a manager, a resource manager of some sort who gets to decide who gets what?
Yeah, I mean, I think the program manager would a resource manager would not be bad at all, especially if you look at it from a training operations side, because you have those limiting step factors, and you can schedule them in. As far as taking the Agile ADDIE framework and applying that, I think that the other team should be working on other steps during that time that resource is unavailable, and they don't have to worry about getting the video necessarily shot, or they can start a shooting session, and if they screw something up, or they can realize it's not the end of the world, because we do have that flexible nature, and taking advantage and creating that opportunity to be efficient and to make progress where you're not beholden to a specific step-by-step progress is really essential to maintaining that effectiveness. And I think you still want to run into some issues if you have like one video camera and you need to shoot a video and you have like 20 people trying to shoot that video. But I think there you start thinking, I mean, if you really want to be agile, how else can we take that video? And that sort of ownership was placed on the subject matter experts, and they did a lot of that thinking. They did a lot of modality thinking, resource thinking. How do we make it efficient as an instructional piece? And so something that typically you bring an SME in, say, okay, I need content for this. Well, they were part of the process and part of the team, and so they brought additional skills and additional resources to bear, and then brought their knowledge to bear as well. So I think you can overcome a lot of that. Some of that, I mean, if you have to enter in through this door and everybody at once, then you are going to still have some of those rate limiting steps though.
And then you'll have to deal with teams who rush themselves to use those resources because they're afraid they're available this week, but not be available to them for another month, and they don't want that delay. So you'll still have some of those issues to manage and work through.
Absolutely. Good. Yep.
All right, do we have any more questions or? All right, then I will have, John, can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I gotta be able to get all my pieces now. I'm gonna go ahead and put you in the waiting room again.
Okay, thank you.
We'll be back soon.